Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Harper, as Jason has said, from Elan EP Limited. This new company that I've set up in the last year after 18 years with Galliard Homes. First off as well, I'd like to thank HeatWeb for inviting me to speak today, and everybody at HeatWeb for inviting me. Thank you. So basically the talk is about HNES, the consumer protection aspects of the regulations proposed and almost coming down the track. The last section I'm going to talk about is heat zoning. So there's been a couple of consultation documents that have been released on all of this in the last year. So the first consultation on consumer protection came out in February this year with a government response. So I've read through a lot of that to hopefully save a lot of you from having to read through it. I'm probably really hopefully going to summarise most of the aspects that are key issues within these consultations and within the proposed regulations. It's a very busy sector at the moment. The government has been investing money across the board, HNES and other aspects. And what is in this presentation gives an outline of the current thinking of DESNES and other people involved in this process, but nothing is certain until it lands as regulation and so on. It's actually been cast. So do bear that in mind when I'm going through some of the points on this. So there's been good investment, as I said, in the heat network regulatory regime from DESNES. And one of the good aspects of what they've done so far is they regard it very much as achieving, good outcomes in terms of carbon emission reduction for the kind of investment and money they're spending on it. So that's quite encouraging because obviously that helps the whole process to continue and keep moving forwards. So that was the slide I was on. We all know about the number of heat schemes and so on that are targeted as being required as UK heat, 18% of UK heat. So that's quite a huge jump, is really all one can say about that. So HNES first off then. The key objective is to reduce carbon emissions, address customer detriment, and to ready the industry for market regulation. The section on the right just shows some of the players in the HNES platform. So we have Ramboll, who are doing application assessments. We have Turner & Townsend doing cost consultancy. And LuxNova are doing the legal advice within that. And the whole thing is being run by Ofgem on behalf of DESNES. So as you're probably aware, HNES has two aspects. The revenue grant that provides 100% of the cost of heat optimization studies, and the capital grant, which can fund 50% of the remedial works. So what I've heard about this aspect is that the capital grant system is not gaining quite the uptake that had been expected. It's the HNES optimization studies are ticking through quite nicely. And most of this is available. If you look at the press releases that DESNES have done over the years, it does give you some idea of what the spend is against their projected spend, and that does really tell that story. The schemes that are having trouble in, I think it's really some RSL schemes they can fund, some RSLs are finding they can find the other half of the 50% of funding, but in some cases that's quite difficult. And again, freeholder-owned schemes, private residential development and so on, sometimes there is money for that, and sometimes there's money that can't be put through the service charge system under Landlord and Tenant Act, can't be put through the service charge system to fund those activities. DESNES themselves will not look at a scheme, for example, that is pretty much, if it's only 1 or 2 years old, their view is that that should have been delivered with the correct design and everything in place that was required to reasonably operate as an efficient scheme. This does cause issues in the sense that a lawyer friend of mine who's an energy partner on this sort of stuff, he and I looked at the cases under the first tier tribunal for Landlord and Tenant Act, and there's a number of cases about cost of energy that people have successfully challenged whoever their supplier of energy is. But we couldn't find anything, this was a few months back, we couldn't find anything, not to say that there hasn't come through now, but we couldn't find anything where under the first tier tribunal claim system that anybody had challenged the efficiency of a heat network. Now that's not to say that that is theoretically possible, and the law is very blunt about what is reasonable. The reasonableness test applies, and somebody could quite easily be successful in that. So the schemes that get funding, as far as I can see, tend to be, it depends on the funding and how good the money is within the RSL in question. It also depends on whether or not it's a freehold scheme and the age. The older it is, the more likely it is to get an ability to pull money from freeholders leaseholders rather in the scheme, to pull money from them to fund remediation of problems with systems. So the next aspect is optimization reports themselves. Well, I've found, because in the system we get people doing optimization reports, but then we get people who are at the next level or next tier addressing the design in detail to get it onto sites and design for the actual installation work of the remedial work. And some of this is a bit patchy. There's a wide range of outputs, and some of the stuff that I've seen I wouldn't regard as being an engineering report. That's simply how my view on it. I don't know what extent my straw poll gives me definition and reliability in terms of percentage of the overall submissions of reports, but there are certainly some problem areas in that. I think there's a risk of the HNES reports being taken by contractors and designers as being a complete scope for the activities that you carry out to do the remedials within a given scheme. And of course, some people, not everybody, but some people would take a view that that's the scope, I take that, I don't think about it, I run with it. And that is not going to deliver across the board comprehensive outcomes and pick up all of the things that do really affect the efficiency outcome within schemes. So I think that could be problematic. Solution to that would probably be to have more prescriptive detail in the outline of what content has to be in an HNES efficiency study report. That would probably help. So on to consumer protection, and consumer protection is a very key part of this whole heat networks activity that DESNZ is carrying out. Obviously, this started off because there were quite a few bad fails on some early heat schemes. Total lack of insulation, the high heat losses, 22% thermal efficiencies from gas into what goes through into the dwellings, pathetic performance, serious outages. There was one scheme in North London where I think residents had no heat, no water for 3 months due to like contractual disputes about who was actually responsible. So there was a lot of that in the early days, and that rumble of that noise and kind of white noise made the government departments sit up and think about that a bit. So that is all being addressed, and a review of the consultation that has been done on this would show there's a lot of information being sort of fed through that would be components that will ultimately be in a consumer protection system, but a lot of the underlying bits have to be questioned, and it's not really been developed. The data we need to do price controls, for example, doesn't exist because the level of metering doesn't exist. And the level of metering is something like 61% of schemes that are on the heat network metering and billing system, 61% don't have metering. So how do we do price control and fair pricing for consumers if we don't have that data that lets us show what an average or a reasonable price might be construed to be? So that's also problematic. So vulnerable persons, this is the key issue as well, again, on customer detriment. Ofgem, this would be mirroring some of the existing utility services sectors in that the Energy UK, which is the logo down the bottom right, they do provide and control that system for the gas industry and for electricity industry and so on. So the protection requirements will be phased in, coming through into the first year of regulation. So once HNES lands, then some of this stuff, the first tranche of stuff on the consumer protection should land at the same time. And I'm just thinking in my own head that that might well mean that DESNZ will have to track the timing of some of these things. If one of the three pieces of the jigsaw puzzle lays behind or sits behind for good reason, unavoidable reasons, that would affect the delivery of the other two, because they want to line some of these up, that as the full regulations come into play, that comes in moving forwards in line with it. So this is the diagram, and that yeah, we did fix that one actually. This note on the right, the first tranche should come in line with HNES, which is back end of 2025. And Phil Jones is going to speak later. He will cover a lot of that and some of that in a lot more detail. Pre-contract transparency and guaranteed consumer protection. This is all key information and key requirements and features of a system for consumer protection. So this again would mirror a lot of things in the existing heat trust and mirror stuff in other utility sectors. So in terms of the data collection then and a platform to store all of this data, there is a desire by DESNZ to make sure that this is hopefully an integrated database which sits in one place, or everybody in the three sections and elements of this feed their data into one repository. Obviously that's a huge piece of work to do in itself, and if all of these different elements we're pushing forwards depend on that, again, that is something else that has to be in place. And that's also, as I said, in terms of probity around the billing and the information about pricing. If that isn't in place, how do we do those bits? So the kind of consultations, frankly, are actually full of a lot of features of how all of these systems will look, but there's an awful lot of elephants in the room that are crowding things out, and any one of which could be a showstopper and certainly delay the whole process quite significantly. So price data is being debated as either the total price or an option looking at the algorithm for calculating variable kilowatt and standing hours. So we're either looking at total price only, but look into price control, or algorithms and detail and standing charge, composition of standing charge and variable charge would be looked at independently. And there was much debate in the consultation and returns from various players in the consultation around all of that. So the other aspect which is very interesting here is that there may well be some kind of heat network efficiency threshold, a threshold over which we would regard that consumers aren't being protected and they're paying unreasonably high costs simply because of subpar efficiencies in the networks. And again, all of this depends on the data. We don't have the data, we don't have the metering, we don't have these bits. Most of this, in terms of the test of what is required in terms of probity and governmental stuff, it's going to fall over at those hurdles. And I think that is definitely going to be a problem going forwards. So one other element that caused much debate and discussions and consultation was disconnection ban. Now, quite a few ESCOs that I've dealt with over 4 or 5 ESCO deals that I've put together with solicitors and our various joint venture companies when I was in a resi business, that most of them did not take the thing as far down the track with any residents who weren't paying their bill. They didn't take it as far down as disconnecting them. They just kept speaking to them, talking to them, bringing them along. But any underpayment on bills clearly went into the pot, and other residents were paying for that on debt and so on. So again, we've got the complexities of further complexity of pay-as-you-go and so on, which need to be integrated into these systems as well. There's the point about 60% of networks currently being unmetered. And the other concern that was right across all of the consultations is the burden to business and the burden to the consumer of cost, delay, transactional costs. All of this is a hit on the industry and increases cost for consumers. So pricing, again, I've really talked through part of this, but it's envisaged that the pricing protection would begin 12 months after HM might land and the consumer protection regulations and its first tranche comes into place. So again, fair and transparent costing and so on. So one of the delays in this, I think I wasn't really able to find hard data on this, but I think we have had the first consultation on consumer protection, and that landed in February with a response from the government. But we were expecting a second consultation, and I don't think we've actually seen the consultation document itself come out yet. So now we're heading towards the back end of this year. That, again, Phil might be able to give some more of an update on where that is, what stage that's at. So, next aspect is heat network zones. So, heat network zone is simply a geographical area that defines the lowest areas that are designated as possibly readily achieving the lowest carbon outcome for decarbonising heating by reducing heat networks. So the heat network zoning is the process of doing that, and there will be, the theory from HNES is there will be a new central authority that oversees all heat network zones across the whole UK. Now, again, an interesting piece of this is that the local zone coordinators may be able to set carbon emission limits on heat networks in their zones. So that really ties in with quite a lot of other cross-cutting legislation and other aspects. So it's quite a difficult one. We've got a long, I think, come back to it on another slide, but we've got a number of different areas that cut across this objective. So one of the objections that CIBSE had, which is quite right, I think, to the consultation, when they talk about the carbon intensity of the thermal energy delivered, that CHP CIBSE were suggesting that the 300 grams proposed for displaced electricity for CHP is a mile out of where we're actually going to be. So this would unfairly favour CHP. I'm not sure if there's some kind of thinking that justifies that. You know, we haven't had a government response on that, so that is coming through. So the next slide then. This is the zoning map, or a typical zoning map. The government had released a couple of months ago a few examples. I think there's about 12 examples of the heat zones and what those maps would look like. So it's obviously just an area with a red line around it. So this particular one is Southwark in London, and that would have had some interaction with the GLA's former heat network priority area system. Now, the priority area system had a soft boundary. When you see what I mentioned further down here, there was a soft boundary approach, where if I had my building and it butted up to the red line, as we said, but it was outside, this is the main area of the area we're talking about, if it butts up to it, they would say that was covered by it was still a requirement. Partly that was due to it being a wide policy within all of GLA policy, but there still wasn't any, didn't seem to appear to be any difference between being within or outside the heat network priority area. It didn't even seem to allow them. They were just, jumping the gun as usual in terms of asking for A, and then when you go in to talk to them after you made a submission, they'd say, well, we want B and C as well. It's like the usual planning problems, that's very typical. So have their cake and then eat it and crap it out and eat it again. I think as rabbits do that, isn't it? But, so basically the heat map may actually sit on that drawing. If it'd be interesting to put the heat map on top of that heat network zone, I'm sure that was used to inform some of the decision making about where that zone is and how it's extents of it. But my impression is that if you overlay that with the heat map, that you end up with a tiny number of dots on that area. So it's not. We're not saying that within that area there's a load of schemes that are so close together. We stick a half-kilometre pipework down the road and it all happens, and we've got a all singing, all dancing heat scheme. It's not really like that. So the timescales to connect on this, then I think if you look at that timeline from left to right, it's about basically a year and a half. A year and 3 months to a year and a half, something like that. And my experience of working on these schemes, we've already got networks like the Vauxhall, Nine Elms and Battersea scheme, is that things like that are made decisions on the very start where the pipework was routed through third-party land. So suddenly you've taken your pipework for a scheme, you're trying to get it in, get it installed and have developers take heat off it. It's just, kiboshed and pushed, another year out because there's transaction time to be done with lawyers for a modification to get provision to bring the pipework across and get a wayleave in place, etc. It's almost as bad as doing an ESCO deal, just to do the timescale to do one lease modification, a date of change in the date of variation in the leases and so on. It's quite difficult and quite time consuming. Has a cost, has the transaction time. So really what should happen there, I think, is that when the site is mooted as being one large new construction site, that should insist that the various developers that are taking different sites should obviously have a wayleave or the right for a wayleave written into their leases when the first developer takes a building lease for a construction of a building within a scheme. So the exemptions may exist in some ways for cost or timing and conservation areas and things. That whole structure of what people get refused an approval for, get an exemption on having to connect to a heat scheme within a heat network zone, that's all open to debate still. The consultation leaves a lot of that open and it's still to be worked through. So as I said a second ago, there's a lot of work to be finished. So there will be a GEM sort of digital portal, which is hopefully, as I mentioned a couple of times, trying to drag all this data into one place. That is their goal, but that is quite a task. So data may be at a later stage in HNES, for example, it may be fed in from bulk heat meters, maybe gas meters as well. I've had schemes where some of the areas, the MAM and so on, who operates the gas meters around various areas of London, some of them, when I want to automate meter reading and half-hour gas reads off the gas meter, they just go, nope, we can't offer you that in this area. I haven't had time to drill down into why that is, but these are the sort of second and third level issues that can start to block us acquiring the data we need in the first place, especially on an ongoing operational basis. So again, there's a lot of common use data here from the heat network of billing all the way through into these new different tranches of regulation that are coming through. So very quick thing on CP1. CP1 will be touched on again, and I think Fairheat have been appointed to look at that. But I won't talk about this at length. I'll leave Phil, who's just arrived. Phil Jones will be talking about that in his presentation later. So challenges, well, we can all clearly see that we need more engineers trained in this specific sector, and probably overall we just need more engineers, full stop, both for design and construction work and for the design work. And the risk with new regulation of any sort is it can become burdensome to the business operating in the sector. And that's also an issue in terms of the maturity of the market, that when a market is immature, it tends to not have too much standardization across the piece. But a more mature market tends to have standardization and repeatability and so on. That makes it easier to regulate. I mean, where we are at the moment, I would say, is the very early days of electricity market, where we had people like one of my great uncles owned a cinema back in Ireland, and he had a generator he was sold to him was far too big, so he decided he'd install street lighting for the council and use that electricity from the cinema generator to drive the street lighting. That's kind of the maturity our market almost has at the moment. We are not what we currently have with the national grid and all of these bodies. We're a long, long way off that, and nobody should think otherwise. Yeah. So some general comments and issues. I think that the legislation across the board, legislation invariably gets into construction and property. It eventually gets in front of the solicitors at some point, so conveyancing inquiry forms may well start to feature elements of, if you're buying a building as a freeholder or you're buying a property as a leaseholder, it may well ultimately start to appear in these conveyancing forms. They'll be looking for compliance with new legislation that affects the dwellings or new legislation that affects the buildings. So it's going to be another hurdle for developers to have to jump through. And because that's a legal issue, it'll stop people's handovers completely in their tracks. And we've already got a lot of this drag from Building Safety Bill, quite rightly, of course, but we have drag from that. Schemes or big delays already being demonstrated in the approvals and so on for compliance with building safety and the regulations and so on. All these things cause delay and cause drag. It's not increasing productivity, it's not developing, it's not helping to deliver. It's just the side effect, but it's not helping to deliver the vast number of new homes that we know we require. So automated metering then is also moving into advanced metering infrastructure. And there's, it's basically more complex and will carry more data in two directions, etc. And that is a goal as well within all of this. So we're not only trying to capture the data we've already got in dumb meters and meters that are pumping out poor quality data and less wide scope on data, we're also targeting making the metering more complex, which is a good target, but should we be doing both at the same time? Probably not. I mentioned the half-hourly data not being available, and TM39 already mentions this is something that I think we should be looking at in more detail. We should be putting meters on the heat generating plant, because a lot is lost in that combustion. If it's a gas boiler or an air source heat pump use, it doesn't get the right temperatures in and out in both scenarios. Is that working properly? Is it in line with the manufacturer's recommendations? Because you can trash, if you've got a rig of 3 boilers with PWM pumps in each boiler, variable speed pumps in each boiler, you can trash that from the noted sort of nominal efficiency in the boiler of like 89%, 90% in gas combustion. You can trash that down to a heat meter beside the boiler rig that only does 63%. So you're throwing away a load of the energy just in heat generation. And I'm not sure that quite a way across the piece that the documentation we've been seeing really addresses that fundamental issue. Again, bulk meters may start to be recorded and pushed onto the databases once they come up. HNES will have an ability to upload and manage your applications and so on, or your notifications under HNES. I'm sure Phil will talk about this in more detail, but there will be an ability to go in and then track what you filled in terms of compliance later on. So that's basically it. It's a complex environment and things are rapidly changing. It's very challenging for everybody, I think, and hopefully that is useful to help get you up to speed. Thank you.